providing access and affordability. We're just now, going through the clinical data, the demand scenarios, the regulatory approvals. All these things are essential for us to put inputs into our plan about how that will work post the donation. So we can't really give more insight into that at this stage, but certainly when we can, we will. And on the expense side, Andy, obviously you had mentioned already that up to $1 billion and unclear on how the accounting will occur, but perhaps you want to add something else to Michael's question?
Sure, Michael. At this point, it's too early to tell you where that's going to fall in the P&L. There are a number of scenarios. Those expenses could fall into cost of goods sold. As you know, they could be R&D expenses, and in some scenarios, a portion of them could also be SG&A expenses. So, at a high level, the expenses that we're referencing, as you would expect, come from manufacturing predominantly, and to a lesser extent, clinical trials. And I think that's our best good faith estimate at this time, based on what we know in terms of the expenses that we see as we ramp up over the year. And we'll do everything we can to provide more color and commentary, in particular on our Q2 earnings call.
I appreciate it. $1 billion of expenses and not knowing the revenue. It's an interesting position. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. May I have the next question, please?
Certainly. Our next question comes from the line of Corey Kasimov with JP Morgan.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. Thank you for taking my question. Wanted to also ask on remdesivir, no surprise. I was wondering if you could talk about the formulation work that's underway to potentially develop an oral and or an inhaled version of the product. Like, how far along might you be on this front, and when can we expect to see something more there?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I'll start out, and maybe others on the call want to add. But our focus, as you can imagine, since January, has been on ramping up the supply, particularly so that we have a lyophilized version that's appropriate for intravenous administration, the clinical program, all of that. So that's really where we've been. At the same time, though, we have had a team, just as with everything with this program, including the supply. We've had teams that have been really, since the very day one in January, been focusing on success. And so if successful, how else could we potentially develop this medicine? I think that's been taken into account from the totality of the clinical trial program, looking at both, critical, severe, and moderate patients. But likewise, we've done the same thing with other alternative delivery mechanisms, presuming success, that might make it more convenient for patients or allow us to broaden the patient group that could benefit from a successful antiviral. And that work is, as you can imagine, still early, but we can say a couple of things. It's not this particular medicine, because it's heavily first pass metabolized in the liver, is not really appropriate as an oral formulation. We've known that for years, probably a decade. But we are looking into things like subcutaneous formulations and potentially inhaled formulations. And although it's too premature to give you timelines on that, rest assured that we've been actively working on those. And as soon as we can give some timelines, we will.
This is the summary of
to see now, particularly because of the efficacy that we've seen this week. We'll continue to pursue those with a great sense of urgency. The timeline is a little premature. Just know that we've been working on it now for several months.
Okay. You're in the Tier 3 health classification.
That's okay. Is that okay, Corey? I know you need more, but
so
we'll give you more.
So what that means is that the full amount of $5,000 is paid out in the event of death due to an accident. In the event of death due to illness.
And our next question comes from the line of Brian Abrahams
pays 10%
with RBC Capital Markets.
Second year,
hey guys,
pays
thanks for taking my
25%.
question. Two questions on remdesivir, if I could.
Pays 50%.
All the work that you guys are doing to bring this treatment to patients. First off, on the NIAID study, can you give us any sense of the proportion of patients who were involved in the interim? Is there any additional update that we should be expecting that could be a gating factor to availability, and your level of confidence that differences in baseline risk factors didn't influence those results as may have happened in the China study? And then just secondly, related to supply, any particular subsets of patients across the studies where you may be seeing the most optimal benefits that you might consider working with regulators to direct the agent to while you're scaling up? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Sorry, just to be clear on your second one related to supply, you said, is there any subset of patients? Can you just complete that one more time?
Yeah, any subset of patients where you might be seeing more benefits, more optimal benefits across the study, where you might consider working with regulators to try and direct the agent to initially as supply gets scaled up.
In terms of like an allocation, yeah, with limited allocation or limited supply.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Merdad, and I'll let Merdad take a stab at both of us, please.
Hi, Brian. On the first question, this is Merdad. On the first question, we have not seen a lot of the baseline demography and the sorts of data that would help in terms of answering your question on the NIAID study. So I think we're all going to have to wait for those data to get published and get put out for us all to review. So I think that's pending, and we'll look for that to come out. In terms of patient subsets, I think our data, and if you look at who's been enrolled in the trials overall, I think we're clearly looking at the hospitalized patient population, and we're looking at patients who are requiring supplemental oxygen as the primary population that we're after, including those that may either become ventilated or may start out mechanically ventilated. Certainly our data support that from our open label trials. The NIAID study enrolled that breadth of patients, but we have not seen subgroup analyses of the different patient populations to give you clarity there. But we believe it'll be in that fairly broad population
on the date that you choose.
Got it. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian.
So
Thank you.
it may
And our
debit.
next question comes from the line of Jeff
May debit
Meacham with Bank of America.
Good afternoon, guys. Just want to say great job on the whole team, really, for the investigator development. A couple of points here on COVID-19. Have you guys looked at other nukes for earlier stage patients? Just thinking about 938 or sofosbuvir. I know you guys have a lot probably that is there that could be more applicable to to mild to moderate patients. And then on remdesivir access, is there a model to license out IP and or manufacturing? I'm just thinking about how to accelerate perhaps broader access outside the U.S. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff, for the thoughts. Everybody at Gilead will appreciate your sentiments. Let's start with COVID and the other nukes. I didn't know whether Merdad or Diana, you want to handle that. I'm not sure how you want to.
Sure. I think right now, this is Merdad again, Jeff. Thanks for the question. Right now, we do believe that remdesivir is the best molecule and has the best potency against the coronavirus. Anything we do, we look at, and both we and others have been looking for other molecules that could have potency here. But remdesivir is certainly the most potent molecule that we have, and that's been our focus. We'll certainly keep looking there. One of the reasons we are focused on looking at alternative formulations for remdesivir is to address the question that you asked, which is how can we get to other patient populations who may benefit from the drug as outpatients, for example. And I think in the short run, I believe that that's going to be the best. The short to medium term, I think that'll be the best approach for us to go. And then I think your second question was about manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
So,
yep. I mean, Andy, maybe you want to take this question as well, because you're leading the group on this. Perfect.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for your comments. Look, on the manufacturing side, I'd say a couple of things at a high level. Is that, again, our primary focus is on providing access to patients around the world. So just like we did with our HIV medicines and HCV medicines, we are deeply focused on this. We have two separate work streams. One is working on our internal supply chain, and making sure that we have a robust supply of starting materials, intermediates, and a strong manufacturing consortium built with companies around the world. You see some of the references to that in Dan's CEO letters, and I would expect that we'll provide some additional information over the coming weeks and months. We do have a second work stream where we are in discussions with large, sophisticated companies around the globe, exploring the potential for other companies to help establish separate end-to-end manufacturing supply chains. The difficulty there, as you might imagine, is that given the scarcity of some of the starting materials, we want to make sure that we don't do anything to impact our supply chain, given that that is the quickest route to getting product to patients who need it all around the world. But we are looking at alternatives. It's too early to give you any specific guidance or to tell you where we're going to land on it. But we are working with a number of companies around the world that you and others know well to see what we could do together and if there's an opportunity to benefit patients in that way. So I'll leave it at that, and then you see.
Yeah, that's great, Andy, and I appreciate your leadership there with your business development head on working with manufacturing. I would just add that we've been a student of other small molecules in this type of setting, whether it's Tamiflu in the past in terms of some of the scale up and stockpiling that occurred there, or students of our own work, if you like, within our HIV portfolio between the developed and the developing world. So we're putting all that knowledge to work as we think about moving fast and wide in terms of our ability to produce supply, but also thinking very thoughtfully about a global footprint here, which would allow for this to, as Andy said, have different geographic representation, which we think is going to be really important. So more to come on that, but we've had teams really focused on that day and night for the past several months, just to give you an idea of that. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And our next question comes from the line of Jeffrey Porges with SVB Leerink.
Thank you very much, and I can't help but echo the comments and appreciate all the great communication as well from Dan on down. So on remdesivir, I'll ask a controversial question, that's no surprise, but Dan, Gilead has generated attractive returns for investors and an attractive return on capital from treating hepatitis C and potentially nearly eliminating hepatitis C, from treating HIV and turning it into a chronic disease, and for building a really important global stockpile of an antiviral for influenza. So what's special about COVID? Should we assume that the capital returns and the profitability for providing a global treatment for COVID long term, after the first 200,000 or 300,000 courses are provided on a donation basis, should we assume the returns are going to be similar to the returns that you've generated in other parts of the business? And then just quickly, can you give us an update on filgotinib? And can you launch this on a virtual basis? Or do you expect to be out of a virtual basis by the time that approval comes?
Terrific. So, Joanna, I'll let you handle the filgotinib, but let me start with your first question, Jeff, and thanks again. And obviously, we are conscious of the fact that this is unique and this is different. You mentioned some parallels to HIV, HCV, even Tamiflu. But there's been no other time like this in the history of the planet that any of us have been alive, in terms of the far-reaching effect of this pandemic, both medically, from a patient perspective, most importantly, but also economically. And so I think there is no guidebook out there. There is no rule book out there, other than that we need to be very thoughtful about how we can make sure we provide access of our medicine to patients around the globe, and do that in a sustainable way for the company, for you as shareholders. And we acknowledge that. And points well taken. And I guess the short answer to your question is, I don't think there is a precedent for this. And so we understand our responsibility, and we understand our responsibility to a variety of different audiences as we approach this. So we'll be working back with you, and we'll certainly be getting feedback from different individuals as we evolve this and as we understand more data around this. but rest assured, we understand our responsibility. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna, please, to talk a little bit about filgotinib.
Sure. So, Jeffrey, I think just a quick update on Filgo. We basically have hired all of our home office personnel, both from a commercial medical standpoint. We've hired our sales leadership, field leadership as well. And we're monitoring the situation really closely, to be honest with you, because nobody really knows when this ends or what's the new normal and when that begins. And so we're just kind of monitoring that and planning for success, to be honest with you, to make sure that we are ready for launch for the second half of 2020 across all of the markets where we hope to get regulatory approval with the US, Japan, as well as Europe towards the end of this year. I think from a virtual launch standpoint, I think those are considerations that we're looking at in scenario planning, and we haven't made a decision. Obviously, that'll be linked to the timing of this pandemic. Having said that, I will also tell you that a lot of our teams are doing virtual right now. Many of the markets are doing remote detailing, virtual speaker programs, et cetera, and working through this environment despite obviously the offices and patients not being open at this point in time. So we're working through all that and looking at the different scenarios, but I think we need to know a little bit more information on the timing of this pandemic and how that plays out towards the end of this year.
Great. Thanks very much for the answers.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. And our next question comes from the line of Matthew Harrison with Morgan Stanley.
Great. Good evening. Thanks for taking the questions and thanks for all your work with remdesivir. I'm going to ask two on HIV. One, can you just talk a little bit about PrEP conversion with Descovy? I think you said you're at 38%, which is actually fairly close to the target you guys were talking about. Do you think you can do better than that or not this year? And then I also noticed in the back of the slides, you were talking about a long-acting bictegravir that you're putting in the clinical studies. Maybe you could comment on that. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Matthew, for the comment. So, Joanna, why don't you start, and perhaps Diana can add on the development side.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Matt. So HIV overall business is, of course, another solid quarter. Again, this year, it's the 8th consecutive quarter of double-digit growth, and that's obviously driven by both the treatment and the PrEP business. So your question specific to Descovy, so we just hit 38%, and so tracking exactly to our plan, right? We had said anywhere between 40 to 45% towards the end of this year, so we feel confident with that number. Obviously, as Andy mentioned in his opening comments, there has been a little bit of a slowdown from a switch standpoint in the PrEP market for obvious reasons, because patients are not going to the physician's offices, but it's modest thus far, and we think a lot of those will be able to recoup towards the end of this year when the pandemic does lift. So we feel still very confident that, we think we're going to be in the range of the 40-45 that we had originally set out, and maybe even if all goes well and we can get out of this pandemic a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit north of that. So Diana, maybe to address the long-acting?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Hi, Matt. So as you probably know, we're really pursuing multiple shots on goal for developing a partner for our capsid inhibitor. We are looking at molecules across different classes, and part of that is looking at the integrase inhibitor class, and we've got really what's the best in class ideal integrase inhibitor right now with bictegravir. And so we've one of our efforts has been in formulating that such that it could be a long-acting injectable and a potential sort of first generation partner for a capsid inhibitor. We've made a lot of progress. As you know, we've got great formulation team here, and we're on the verge of getting that into the clinic. Now, most phase 1 centers globally really have been shut down or paused, so the timing there is a little bit uncertain, but we're ready and hoping to have data by the end of the year.
Great. Thank you, Diana. So why don't we go to the next question? Thanks, Matt.
Our next question comes from the line of Umer Raffat with Evercore.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. Dan, we really admire Gilead's efforts during the pandemic and the drug donations, etc. But as we go beyond that, it does seem like there will be a commercial business in the broader COVID landscape. And I don't want to peg you to a dollar number, but I do want to ask this. Do you envision Gilead's product offerings for COVID being beyond remdesivir? For example, PI combinations and or even partnering with vaccine companies of sorts. I'm just trying to understand how you envision this category for Gilead, if I may. And Mirdad, if I may ask you a quick two-part question. First, do you have a certain lung concentration in mind that you're targeting? And is that much less than the 20 micromolars that was laid out in the New England Journal paper? And do we have any data from humans on what lung concentrations are we actually seeing with remdesivir with the dose that's in the clinic? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your thoughtful work. Getting back to remdesivir and how do we see this playing out over time? Again, I'm going to have to come back to some of the bases of what I said before, which is we really need some time now to reflect upon a very volatile, changing situation to determine both on a clinical side, regulatory side, pandemic side, epidemiology, what the right sustainable model is. Rest assured that we'll come back to you as soon as we can digest that, and as soon as actually a little bit more time passes, which was also one of the important reasons for the donation, to allow us to obtain more information as well about what that sustainable plan and model is. But I'll just make a couple of comments on what you said, and it was also echoed by Dr. Fauci yesterday, which is, with the NIAID results and the highly statistical significant reduction in time to recovery, this now changes the landscape, if you like, for drug development within COVID-19, being that one has to now think about comparing to remdesivir and or looking at adding to remdesivir, which I think is exactly what the NIH trial is going to do now. And I'm sure all of our collaborators within the drug development space, we have been working with them. We're going to continue to work with them on the most thoughtful hypotheses around how we might be able to consider, just as, one reflects upon the HIV building, decades ago, that remdesivir becomes kind of the base therapy, and one looks to try to improve symptomology improvements, mortality improvements, expanding patient populations. And so that is yet another factor that will go into how we determine how best to create a sustainable solution for remdesivir. But clearly all those things we have been thinking about, and now we have to accelerate now that we have these trial results. So more to come on that. I will have Mirdad, you answer the lung question, if you could, please, for Umar.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hey, Umar. So what I would say is the concentration that we're looking for, as you know, we think our EC50 in human cells is in the tens of nanomolar range. And we know our serum concentration gets in the micromolar range. And so we should be more than adequately covered by achieving those levels with the current dosing paradigm that we have, probably by an order of magnitude or two. Certainly in the serum, and based on model data in non-human primates as well as mice, we see more than adequate concentrations getting into the lung of those animals, and in vivo efficacy in those animals. And I think the clinical benefits we're seeing suggest that's exactly what's happening in humans as well. So I think we're pretty comfortable with where we are in terms of both dosing and exposure, including in the lung.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Umar. Okay, can we have the next question, please?
Our next question comes from the line of Alethia Young with Cantor Fitzgerald.
Hey guys, thanks for taking my question, and thank you for your contribution in solving the world's problems. Maybe just 1.5 for me. Were you surprised just with the severe kind of working as it did with an antiretroviral? Did you kind of think that you might need to have people kind of earlier in the virus for it to work? And do you think it worked better there? And then the second question is just a little bit around HIV. Are you seeing buying patterns changing in the public market, so like the Medicaid, the prisons, et cetera, et cetera? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks an awful lot, Alethea, again, for your comments. I'm going to turn the first question over to Merdad and the second one over to Joanna. But just as I do on your first question, and I think Merdad can fill in the details here, but, there's been a surprising consistency across all the different data elements in our clinical program, from compassionate use to interrogating what we know about the China trial to the severe trial. To the NIAID trial. And I think that is maybe not something that's completely well understood out there. I think, Merdad, as a part of your response, I think it'd be helpful for you to reflect upon that as well, if it's okay.
Yeah, no, of course. I think, Alethea, we all were using the parallel construct of influenza for our thinking around remdesivir, right? Which was you got to get in really early, given the viral kinetics in influenza, and getting in too late probably won't have much of an impact. And I remember an investor call a couple months ago where I said that as well, and that was certainly our expectation. However, the wild card here, and what I think we're still learning, is what are the viral kinetics in patients with this virus. How long does that last, and how quickly does it go up, and how quickly can we have an impact on it? So I think the data are the data. Essentially, we are seeing efficacy across both patient populations, but also across trials that are really all tracking in the same direction as Dan alluded to. So even if you look at the China data, the hazard ratios for improvement are consistently positive. The study was underpowered, and I think the hazard ratios we'll probably see from the NIAID study are going to be in the same ballpark. But with an appropriate sample size, they're highly statistically significant. Similarly, I think when we look at the mortality data, when we look at all of those different factors, this virus seems to be behaving differently. Remdesivir seems to be having efficacy in a relatively broad patient population. So I think, we're learning as we go. We'll learn more as more data are generated, right? We have our moderate data coming up where we'll be looking at it an even less severely ill patient population. So there'll be more data coming out in that population that may add to our knowledge base here to understand the spectrum. And as we talked about earlier, understanding the efficacy in the subgroups in the NIAID study will be really interesting in this, and we don't have that information yet. So I think all those data will contribute to our overall understanding of how early do you need to be in? Do patients who have symptoms for less time do better? Those are certainly the trends, but there certainly seems to be benefit even in patients who have longer duration of symptoms right now. Maybe I'll hand it off to Joanna for the HIV question.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Alethea, just a couple of things. We have a couple of moving pieces in the first quarter for HIV. So I just want to, because it's not just one piece that's making the difference here. And so the first one is obviously the seasonal inventory, right? There's a Q4 load up and then Q1 draw down. So that's definitely happening in Q1. Then we also had towards late March, like I'm sure many did as well, the prescription number of days per prescription rise and inventories rise towards end of March. So we had a bit of a mix of those two things. And specifically to government channels that you were asking, the buying patterns, we do normally see in Q1 a little bit more of a higher mix towards government channels in the first quarter, and that obviously negatively impacts our payer mix. So that is definitely happening in the first quarter of this year.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Alethea. Can we have the next question, please?
Yes, our next question comes from the line of Mohit Bansal with Citigroup.
Great. Thanks for taking my question. And I would also add my appreciation for your efforts against COVID-19. A quick one from my side, if you can help me. If you can you please update us on your collaboration programs with Galapagos timelines at this point, both for IPF as well as osteoarthritis, and specifically on osteoarthritis program? How important is it for Gilead to see improvement in pain when we see the data for you to take a decision to opt in there? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohit. I'm going to turn it over to Merdad. Thank you, Merdad.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mohit. So with the IPF program, there is a scheduled interim analysis that will be coming up early next year, and we think things will stay on track. Again, I'll put some error bars around the pandemic, but I don't think that should be impacted, at least today. So that'll be something that we'll be clearly looking forward to, and it will be important to how we proceed there. In terms of the osteoarthritis, it's a great question. You know, I think while seeing structural improvement is going to be really important and interesting, certainly thus far the regulatory guidance has included looking at symptoms like pain for improvement. So we can push on that. Obviously, if we see structural improvement and we haven't been powered, for example, as a for pain, then we'll have to look at that and think about what the implications of that are and discuss it with the regulators. So I think what we'll be looking for is directionality on all the endpoints that we will be measuring to make the smart decision in terms of moving forward with that program.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mohit. So let's go to the next question, please.
Our next question comes from the line of Robin Karnauskas with SunTrust.
Hi, guys. Thanks for taking my question. And again, great work on all the things you're doing to help us with COVID. So, there's a lot of talk about remdesivir being approved for emergency use. And can you just clarify, does that mean that at that point in time versus now where it's compassionate use, you actually could charge for the drug? And, when you say affordable, does that mean a positive margin for the product? And lastly, from a science point of view, help me understand what would it take for some of these drugs or your drug on top of other drugs to work in a ventilator patient, do you think, theoretically? Thank you.
Great. So I'll turn the ventilator question over to Merdad in just a second, but thanks. So we'll clarify the EUA. So yes, I mean, under an emergency use authorization, one could charge for the product. We made a decision, as you know, to donate 1.5 million vials, which is the entirety of our supply through the early summer. And that's for a variety of uses, right? I mean, that's for clinical trials, as one would expect not to charge for those, of course, compassionate use, EAP in other countries, but also available is that supply for regulatory approvals around the world, and we'll allocate accordingly as those regulatory approvals come online. So yes, it is possible to charge. I would just say that our goal here is to get a full approval for remdesivir. We feel the data supports that, and an EUA therefore is a step to really a more formalized approval. The reason the agency and we are talking about that is that these are extraordinary times, right? So weeks would make a difference to be able to get medicine to patients by enacting an EUA, if that's what the FDA chooses to do, prior to another form of approval. And so it's a stepwise approach, which allows us to immediately address the humanitarian need while still pursuing all the aspects of a normal approval, which we are doing with the FDA. So I think that's probably the most important point. And again, I know, Robin, and trust us, we will be answering your questions on the sustainable model for remdesivir in the future, in the near future. We just don't have the answers yet, but we deeply respect and appreciate the fact that when we get into millions of doses, we have to have a sustainable economic model that works here and that achieves access to and affordability to patients around the world. So more to come on that. If I could turn it over to Merdad on the ventilated treatment approach.
Yeah, Robin, excellent question. Thanks. The criticality of this comes down to a timing question, right? It really comes down to how long is viral replication ongoing in the lungs of patients, and how quickly do patients deteriorate to needing mechanical ventilation. Certainly, what we're seeing is that patients are very, very rapidly deteriorating. Some patients deteriorate rapidly. Wow. So getting them antiviral therapy in that time frame where it seems that there's still viral replication going on, certainly seems to be benefiting those patients. And probably what's going on, and this is speculation on my part, is by limiting the viral replication, you're going to limit the inflammation. You're going to reduce the number of people who develop lung injury, and you're going to get them off the ventilator faster. So the discharge rates that we're seeing, where the people are being discharged 4 days earlier, for example, in the NIAID study, underlying that are patients who are de-escalating or deeper oxygenation, and that leads them to getting onto room air more quickly. And I think so there's a time element in all of this that I think is probably where we're benefiting these patients. Certainly, if you talk about people who've been ventilated for a week or 2 weeks, the question of whether an antiviral would be beneficial, I think seems more difficult to tie into what's going on. But again, it comes down to understanding the viral kinetics here, and that's a work in progress, I think, for all of us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robin. Can we have the next question, please?
Our next question comes from the line of Salim Saeed with Mizuho.
Hey guys, thanks so much for the question, and I echo all my peers' comments on the great work you guys have done on remdesivir. Dan, maybe just one for me, a high level question here around your involvement maybe with folks in Washington, your discussions there. So obviously, biotech for some time has been about, from a Washington perspective, about drug pricing, and the rhetoric's been pretty negative. I'm wondering if the rhetoric has changed at all in your view when you're dealing with folks there, how it's particularly changed given you guys are so key to this remdesivir and the solution to COVID-19.
Yeah, thanks, Salim. These are unusual times for all of us, I'm sure, in all of your areas of interest as well as ours. And so, what I can say is that I think, people have come together in a variety of ways, and certainly that's also occurred to a certain degree in Washington. And I've spent a decent amount of time in Washington over the past several months, certainly before the shelter in place. And I think even then, there is some change in the rhetoric. I think for highly innovative research-based companies that have immediately kind of shifted their efforts to solutions in the coronavirus. It's pretty impressive, actually, and many of their peers in the industry that I stay in very close touch with, have spared no expense to kind of pivot and shift. So I think at the end of the day, I think this will certainly help the industry's reputation. I think the ability to solve a human crisis like this, because of the decades of investment and the at-risk investment that's done, by so many companies, people I think will, and the general public will see that, and whether that's different types of treatments or vaccines, I think that'll be the case. But certainly, to your point, I think the tone is different in Washington. I think people are very appreciative and concerned about finding solutions here. And it's brought us all together, which I think is a good thing. I'm not suggesting that there won't continue to be focus and pressure on drug pricing. Of course, there will be. And we continue to work appropriately to make sure that, in particular, that patients that are bearing the brunt sometimes of some of the pharmaceutical pricing, that legislation is put into place that supports that. and improves that for patients, and that we lean in as an industry and as a company to give more that flows through to patients. So all of those principles, I think, still apply, but it's being done now in a way where we can have, an appreciation for the innovation the industry brings. So more to come, and a lot still to happen this year with the election coming up and with other things. But I think from a Gilead perspective, we stay focused on innovative medicines, on making we have access programs, on leaning into legislation that supports the innovative industry and that supports reducing patient out-of-pocket costs. And that'll be our focus accordingly, Salim. So hope that gives a little bit of a insight.
Super helpful. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Thank you. Our next question comes from the line of Tyler Van Buren with Piper Sandler.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for everything that you're doing, and have a couple more remdesivir questions, of course. Given your experience, your expertise in viral infections and all the natural history that you guys are collecting in real time, wanted to ask you about your latest thoughts on the nature of COVID-19 recurrence. Your base case assumes a peak potentially by July, a return in the fall and winter, but a lower impact. So is it possible to provide a rough quantification of what that lower impact might be? And then also in subsequent years, is this something that you would expect in that base case to peter out or to be with us for, potentially the next decade or two? And then the second question is just following up on your earlier comments on FDA interactions and potential pathways to approval, which was helpful. Have you guys had labeling discussions? Is there any color you could provide there?
On remdesivir, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Thanks, Tyler, again for the comments. And I might ask if Andy and Merdad want to comment on the first question. Let me start with the second. So, we've been in constant dialogue with the agency on remdesivir. I just have to really, also say how thankful we are for the FDA and other members of the government, the coronavirus task force, that have really made themselves available, really, literally all the time when we need them, and vice versa. So it's been a very good collaborative relationship. In terms of remdesivir and the interactions with the FDA, I mean, we have been working with them on, the submission. They've been open to receiving parts of the submission, which has been very helpful under a normal process. Plus, there's the whole EUA process that kind of goes on top of that. So, yes, the answer is, and you can imagine that obviously that's been going on for weeks and actually a couple of months now. But in the past 48 hours, it's increased in intensity. So we are, and the team is in constant kind of information exchange with the agency right now, and they're getting information from us, obviously from NIH and the NIV trial. And there's a big sense of urgency here. I think FDA understands the importance of reacting quickly to this, and so it's intense right now. And we think the FDA will move quite quickly on their decisioning on the labeling side. So back to the lower impact on the base case. I don't know, Merdad, from a scientific perspective, or Andy, if you want to provide any other. I think we don't have a crystal ball, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think Tyler, we're as much a consumer as others. I think we are. Obviously, our data are a snapshot into what's going on, but we use for our modeling, we use the external epidemiology data and use that right now to get the broader picture. So I don't think we have any unique insights today that don't rely on the same sources that everyone else. So that's I think where we are. Obviously, as we capture more data, maybe that will change. But today, I think that's where we are. And I'll just echo what Dan said. This has been an unprecedented time in terms of our interactions with the regulators, both here in the U.S. as well as outside the U.S. It's been really impressive and truly collaborative, working with the NIH and the FDA in parallel over the past couple of months. We talk constantly, and the same is true with the EMA. Same is true with Japan. We're talking to all the regulators in parallel. So it's been a pretty unique situation, and I think everyone understands the gravity. So that's been very helpful in moving forward collaboratively.
Thanks, Merdad.
Thanks very much for taking the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Appreciate it. So we have time for one last question. If the operator, we can have the last question, that would be terrific.
Our last question comes from the line of Phil Nadeau with Cowen and Company.
Good afternoon. Thanks for fitting me in, and let me add my appreciation for your diligence in attacking COVID.
Thanks,
just
Phil.
two more questions on remdesivir. The first is on the upcoming data from the SIMPLE trial, the moderate trial due in May. Can you remind us how the enrollment criteria and endpoint definitions differed between the NIAID trial and that upcoming data set, and therefore should we expect similar data, or are there notable differences? And then second, just a follow-up question on Tyler's. On the FDA approval pathway, Dan, your answer to Tyler's question suggests that you may not need any more data to get a formal FDA approval. The NIAID trial might be sufficient. Is that your current understanding of your FDA dialogue?
Yeah, I'll let Merdad also discuss. So I'm just look. The discussions are still ongoing in terms of what's required for a formal approval. What I meant to infer earlier is that the NIAID data demonstrate safety and efficacy at a highly statistical level, right? Which is usually the barrier for a full approval. So that's what we're working with them on. And I don't want to get ahead of the agency on that, if that's okay. So, but again, I do believe that there is most likely kind of a two-step process, with potentially an EUA being granted and then moving on to the full approval. Having said that, can I turn to Merdad or Diana? Merdad, okay, on the first question.
Yeah, I was actually going to see if Diana wanted to answer that question.
Okay, yeah, that's great, Diana. Thank you.
Sure thing. Yeah. So in terms of endpoints, the NIAID study looked at time to clinical recovery using the 7-point ordinal scale. And the ordinal scale is really tracking throughout most of the major clinical trials right now. But as our understanding of the disease has evolved, the types of endpoints using that scale has evolved. And so NIAID changed to time to clinical recovery, which basically means no longer requiring medical care within the hospital, getting off of oxygen or live discharge. In our moderate study, we're using the ordinal scale as well, but we're looking at the day 11 distribution along that ordinal scale. So similar to what we did in our severe study, but looking at day 11 instead of day 14, recognizing that we're looking at a population that's less sick. So the moderate study is looking at patients who are hospitalized, but they're not hypoxic, they're not requiring oxygen. The NIAID study enrolled patients from starting there, but all the way through mechanical ventilation. So slightly different endpoints for slightly different patient populations, and most importantly, really looking at different questions. We're looking at treatment duration, they're looking at primary safety and efficacy with a placebo control.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Phil. So with that, I think we'll turn the call over to Doug to close. But let me just say thank you very much to all of you, and we really appreciate your trust and confidence in Gilead, and we'll continue to do our best throughout what we do for patients and certainly for COVID-19. So with that, Doug, do you want to have the last word?
Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your continued interest in Gilead, and the team here looks forward to providing you with updates on our future progress.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in today's conference. This does conclude the program, and you may all disconnect.